Hello everyone, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum here in Morristown, Tennessee. And we want to welcome y'all to another episode, that being the second chapter in the life of George Washington. In last week's episode, we finished by discussing how, in February of 1754, Governor Dinwiddie had sent Washington on a diplomatic mission to drive the French from the contested forks of the Ohio. Although this mission was a failure, Governor Dinwiddie surely was no quitter, and he yet again sent Washington northward, this time to force the French from the Ohio country. What Washington didn't know as he wended his way northward was that his journey would be that which would light the fuse to a powder keg, one which would explode across the continent, resulting in the 7 Years' War. Washington left on this particular quest in April of 1754 with half the Virginia regiment. As he made his way northward, he gained intelligence that there was a French force of about 1,000 who had begun construction on Fort Duquesne. However, Washington was not necessarily perturbed by these news, for he took his time to construct a fort himself at Great Meadows. It was not too long after this that Washington had received intelligence that a French force was camped about several miles away from his position, and he decided to go on the offensive. When he heard that the force was only about 50 or so, he decided upon an ambush. So together with the Virginians and their Indian allies on May 28th, they attacked the French and killed them, including their commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, who was carrying a diplomatic message for the British. The French would later find their fallen comrades in the forest, scalped and mutilated, and they blamed Washington for the incident. But Washington was nowhere to be found, having already returned to his position at Fort Necessity. Once there, shortly afterwards, Washington was rejoined with the other half of the Virginia regiment, as well as a group of about 100 South Carolinians under the command of Captain James McKay. Now, James McKay's Royal Commission outranked Washington's, and a conflict of command ensued very quickly. But that didn't really matter, because on July 3rd, a force of about 900 French soldiers attacked Fort Necessity. The ensuing battle would result in Washington's surrender, and Washington was forced to sign a soggy, rain-soaked document in which he not only agreed to the terms of surrender, but unknowingly admitted or took responsibility for the killing of Jumonville. The problem with this is that Washington did not speak French, and so he had a translator to read it for him, which in later years Washington would blame the translator for not properly translating the document. Either way, this didn't really matter all that much, because shortly after this Jumonville affair, the Virginia regiment was divided, and Governor Dinwiddie offered Washington a captaincy over one of the regiments. Washington refused this because it would be a demotion, for the British had already passed a law that colonial officers could not be stationed any higher than a captain. So Washington refused this. But regardless of all that, the Jumonville affair, which he had taken a part of on May the 28th of 1754, would later be the incident which would ignite the French and Indian War. In 1755, Washington went ahead and volunteered his services to General Edward Braddock, who was Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in America. And he, at his suggestion, split his forces when Washington told him that it would be much smarter to divide the regiments into a large column and a smaller flying column. Unfortunately, though, Washington, who was severely ill with dysentery at the time, was not able to join the initial expeditionary forces, but when General Edward Braddock had reached the Monongahela, Washington finally caught up with him, although still ill. It was shortly after they had reunited that Washington and his companions found themselves attacked by a force of combined French and Indians. And this resulted in the Battle of the Monongahela, in which 2/3 of the British forces were casualties, and General Edward Braddock was killed. At this point, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, Washington commanded a rearguard force, which allowed the rest of the British and the colonial allies to retreat safely from the field of battle. And in this battle, it's interesting to note that Washington actually had 2 horses shot out from under him, and by the time he returned to camp that night, he noticed that his hat and coat were just riddled with bullet holes. And I have to go slightly off tangent here because it's so interesting to note, but unfortunately the name of this Indian chieftain escapes my mind at the moment. But It's rumored that in later years, when George Washington became the president of the United States, sorry, bit of a spoiler alert, but this chieftain asked to see George Washington in person. And so, he being too elderly to actually make the trip all the way to where Washington was at, Washington went to his village instead. And the chieftain told him that he had some of his best marksmen, including himself, actually aiming their rifles and muskets consistently at George Washington, and yet it seemed like there was a supernatural hedge of protection about him, and none of his men could bring him down. Whether or not that story is actually true, we don't exactly have the documentation to prove that, but it is an interesting story nonetheless. Following the Battle of Monongahela, a disastrous defeat for the British and their colonial comrades, we see that in August of 1755, the Virginia Regiment was once again reconstituted, and Governor Dinwiddie appointed Washington in charge, this time, again, with the rank of a colonel. But George Washington clashed over command almost immediately, this time with a Captain John Dagworthy, who commanded a regiment of Marylanders at Fort Cumberland. But what we see is that Washington, while he was there, he grew impatient for an offensive attack against Fort Duquesne and the French. And he was convinced that had Braddock survived the Battle of Monongahela, that he would have actually granted Washington a royal commission. And so, being hard-pressed to try and get this commission, he took up the matter with Braddock's successor as Commander-in-Chief, William Shirley, in February of 1756, and yet again a second time in January of 1757 with Shirley's successor, Lord Loudon. Lord Loudon humiliated Washington, refusing him a royal commission, and only agreed to relieve him of the responsibility of manning Fort Cumberland. But it would be just a few years later that in 1758, the British Forbes expedition was to take place, in which they intended to assault and capture Fort Duquesne, and the Virginia Regiment, Washington included, were asked to come along with this task. As Washington made his way further northward with General Forbes, we see that yet again, as in the wake of General Braddock, that Forbes took Washington's advice on some particular maneuvers and how to position the men. But when it came down to the best route to approach the fort, as well as how to best attack the fort, well, he refused to listen to Washington outright. But that didn't really matter, for there was to be no battle of Fort Duquesne, because by the time the Forbes expedition had gotten there, the French had not only abandoned the fort, but they abandoned the valley. So, however, there was a friendly fire incident which Washington saw, resulting in 14 dead and 26 wounded. And at this point, Washington was just kind of done with the military. He was done getting pushed around by the British officers, being refused a royal commission, and so he decided to resign his commission for what he had hoped would be good and all. And then, with that, he left homewards to Mount Vernon. It would be in the year of 1759, on January 6th, that George Washington, at the age of 26, married the 27-year-old widow Martha Dandridge Custis. She was the widow of a wealthy plantation owner, Daniel Parke Custis. Martha Custis was a very well-to-do woman, but she was also just a good woman in general. She was generous, kind, intelligent, and she had some experience with managing a great plantation, such as her husband's. But she knew she needed the aid of a man, and so that's where George came in. And George Washington ended up taking control of and taking care of her one-third interest in the Custis estate, which granted him about 18,000 acres, and he also supervised the remaining two-thirds for Martha's children. But regardless, with the land that he had already accrued during his surveying in his earlier years, combine that with the Custis estate land that he now owned, well, he became one of the wealthiest men in the colony of Virginia, and this granted him a much higher social status than what he had previously been used to. And it was because of this that he found a little bit of extra time for leisure, as well as to build up the infrastructure of Mount Vernon, including increasing his landholding and slaveholding property. He also took the time to grow tobacco and wheat to great effect. In fact, Washington became one of the biggest distillers in the nation, just for whiskey alone. But Washington also found time to engage in the more gentlemanly pursuits of politics. and this granted him access to represent Frederick County in Virginia's House of Burgesses. But at the beginning of his terms in the House of Burgesses, Washington, if he was there, he rarely spoke up and even wouldn't attend outright. But as things started to get more and more hairy with relations with the British, Washington started to become more outspoken. Particularly in 1763, when the Royal Proclamation with the British and the Indian people had been signed, Washington, like many other landowners, surveyors, and so on and so forth, they did not like that, for they felt that they had been cheated for fighting for the British to gain control of this country, and now the British was saying that they could not actually move and settle onto that land or own any of that land. So they felt cheated. Washington also had issues with other certain policies that the British enacted against the colonists, including some of their mercantilist policies, which in 1764 had affected not just the upper class, but Washington himself, so much so that in 1764 he was in debt by an amount of 1,800 pounds. Washington also did not care for the Stamp Act of 1765 and celebrated when it was repealed. He also spoke out against the Townshend Acts and most definitely the Coercive Acts, which were put into effect after the British Parliament sought to punish Massachusetts colonists for the Boston Tea Party in 1774. Washington called these coercive acts an invasion of our rights and privacies. Now, it was a long back and forth battle from the 1760s and the 1770s, or at least in the early part of the 1770s, to the British trying to enact laws and also repealing them because the American colonists would revolt or riot or what have you. And so things seemed to be at a standstill or a stalemate. But finally, as I'm sure anyone who's read a history textbook will know, in April of 1775, the Revolutionary War broke out with the battles of Lexington and Concord. And upon hearing the news, Washington hastily departed Mount Vernon on May the 4th to join the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. What Washington did not know was that his presence at the Second Continental Congress would catapult him into a journey that he would have never imagined he would be taking in 1,000 years. A journey that would lead to him not only fighting in one of the greatest wars of our nation, but also leading to him receiving one of the greatest positions in our nation. But although Washington at the time had a temporary lack of knowledge, what I know is that you won't want to miss next week's episode as we continue to tell the story of the life of George Washington. But I must digress. Before we sign off here, folks, I have to go ahead and tell you, as always, we want to thank you so much for joining along on Facebook and YouTube. Your support is greatly appreciated. And also, if you haven't yet, then please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as click the bell icon so you'll never miss an upload. But I've already taken enough time out of your day, so I'll go ahead and get out of your hair. Now, before I go ahead and sign off, one more thing I want to say to all you lovebirds out there. I hope you have a happy Valentine's Day. Make it a good one. But with that being said, this is Isaac White signing off from the Crockett Tavern Museum for now, saying goodbye and God bless.